Join us for PR Safari, a podcast by Center for Public Relations. PR Safari, your ultimate guide to navigate the complex PR landscape in Africa. Find us at www.cpr.africa.
Hello and welcome. I am Chris Wangalwa, and with me today is our guest and guide, Saburi Chirimi. Saburi is currently the Senior Communications Manager at For Africa, an organization she describes as the largest African humanitarian and development organization working for Africa that thrives. At the time of recording this episode, Saburi served as the Head of Executive Strategy and Communications at Oxfam International. And prior to that, she was Senior Consultant, Africa Regional Lead at Portland Communications. Today, Saburi and I are going to break down how to make communication run like a well-oiled machine.
The so what question, when you were thinking about what to speak about today, comes from a conversation that I used to have with the chair of the board of the organization that I was doing business development for. You'd take weeks and months on end to close a business deal, and it's a big one, maybe averaging the millions. And everyone is cheering you on that week. You close the deal, papers are signed, you hand over to the next business process that will now take on the onboarding of the customer. And I mean, you're celebrating, then you go home, and the following day you come, and the question is basically, so what? What's next?
Even though you've brought those big monies, the question still lingers. So what?
Yes, basically, so what? You've done that, then what next? Your job is not tied to a specific moment in time. You're required, as soon as you finish that win, quote unquote, to be basically moving on to the next.
We need another win.
So, yes. so what? Whatever you're telling me, that was like last week's story.
That is history.
So what are we moving on next to, and how is it building basically our presence, our market share, and our positioning in the market? And I mean, it's a tough question when you're in that spot, but I think it always resonates, especially when I moved into the communications sector, because I kind of feel, in as much as it might not be asked in the same way, there's quite close parallels that can be drawn from the communications experience as well. You're coming into an organization, whether as an agency or an in-house communications person, they are keen on delivering a campaign. You're tasked with delivering X, Y, and Z deliverables. You work all your angles and you're successful in delivering a massive win. But as soon as that's done and the report is dusted and signed off, you're basically on next to the so what. For me, the bigger question beyond the so what is, how then do we make communications in a way that is not individual wins for campaigns, but it's basically like a domino effect where one win builds over to the next. And I also want to tie it to something that sometimes is often forgotten in the chase for the next big thing, which is the organizational goals and the organizational's purpose for existence. So what exactly does the organization want to achieve, and how then does communication really tie into that in a way that even when I'm reporting my results, I can make very clear parallels between what I have achieved versus what the organization wants to achieve as its own goal. I'll step back a bit and maybe pose a question. Why do organizations exist?
Why do organizations exist?
Yes.
I have just asked you that question.
So why do organizations exist? So in the simplest of forms, we can say that organizations exist to solve a problem. And the problem, if you're in the for-profit sector, is you provide a solution, a product or a service, and from there you get a profit. If you're in the not-for-profit sector, you are addressing a certain cause, and from there it basically solves whatever problem it is, be it water, lack of water, be it poverty, be it inequality, whatever issue that the non-profit organization is working on. The challenge that I've often seen is that there's often a disconnect for very many functions within the organization against the quote-unquote problem that the organization is seeking to solve. For example, even before we dive into the communications function, if you ask the accountant, what exactly do you do? Hardly ever will they define their role against the overall organization mission. They'll tell you, I manage the books, I pay salaries, I'm the payroll officer. If you ask probably the people who are doing the front office, I manage the front desk, but hardly ever do these job functions really tie back to the specific mission or goal that the organization is out there to achieve. And because of this fragmentation, it's the same approach that the communication functions then comes into play with. You're hired as a big comms person and you're told, we want our comms to be effective. but hardly ever has the organization or previous comms people, or even just in the whole setup and introspection of what exactly you're expecting from the comms, hardly ever has there been discussions of how exactly then comms comes into solving that business problem. So let's say for a profit organization, your role is as a comms person, you're selling tins of, let's say, margarine, and you're told, okay, you're the public relations person. Often discussions have not happened internally on how then do you measure the sale of the cans of margarine against your quote-unquote public relations function. You're just told, you're doing public relations, and then there's a marketing function, yes, which is a very disconnected way of doing things. Because if you step out of the organization and look at it from the consumer function, the consumer doesn't see these entities as separate. They just see one big organization.
Or they even have no idea about the organization.
Exactly.
They just know the product.
They just know the product. So how do we then internally kind of bring all these functions together to ultimately solve this problem that the business was brought in to solve? Why did the business start? We want to sell cans of margarine because we believe if we do, then X, Y, and Z will happen. So how do we then really integrate all those functions to ensure that everything that happens then internally then builds towards the ultimate goal for this organization? I think the reason for this is important simply because when you do it in a way that's not integrated, then you lose out on the impact that you have on your audiences and the impact that you have on your overall business objectives. Again, stepping outside, we are not operating as a vacuum as an organization. We are operating within a context, and this context has very many variables that basically determine the outcome of whatever actions we take. Because of that, then we have to be really close, because we can't have the marketing people doing one thing, the PR people doing their own thing, advertising people are setting up billboards, then the comms person is just there, with their op-eds and media hits. It's so disintegrated that it doesn't even make quote-unquote logical sense.
Yes.
And then that's where you find a situation where even when you're reporting, there's really no direct lines, because even as you're setting out your strategies, there was really no conversation of, okay, what does our world look like? And what exactly are we hoping to solve as the business problem? And how then do these different parts then all fit together?
I've been thinking loud and sometimes quietly about an organization that makes candy versus an organization that is in the theory of change, say Oxfam.
Yes.
So now there is business model versus theory of change. And yes, we could say an organization exists to solve a problem. Some organizations, maybe they just exist to make money, not necessarily to solve a problem. If you look at some products, you wonder, do these harm the society or do these help the society? When we talk about ESG, and there's an organization that makes, products that do not conform to ESG. And as you explained, this divergence or conflict of roles or disconnect in terms of having to have thought about what every organ in the organization brings to the table, then the question becomes, what really does marketing do that communication shouldn't do or is not doing? And what does front office do that communication is not doing? And does that mean that each of these components, including accounts, is in fact communication?
Interesting perspective. So we'll start with the analogy of the problem and how basically we define it. When I say problem, I don't necessarily mean in the dictionary sense of this is a challenge that needs to be addressed, but basically it's more like an itch. The organization has identified an itch and they have a solution to that itch. That's what I define a problem as. So it might be they've just realized that there is this need for entertainment. So in the very basic sense, if we were to define another way of a problem beyond the analogy of the itch, I'd call it, what does Maslow define as the basic hierarchy of needs?
Yes.
And whatever an organization does, in a way, is kind of solving either the needs from the pyramid and, of course, also building up. And that's where now you have the different categories of products, services, and I think even the theory of change. So the difference between basically an organization that's selling product versus an organization that's working towards a theory of change, I think, is ultimately what is your defined outcome. One might be primarily seeking profit. One might be primarily seeking to change something, so maybe it's more cause-driven. But I think ultimately there's an underlying thing that's lacking or seeking to be filled as a need that this organization now plays a part in that role.
Whether it is harmful or not.
Whether it's harmful or not. The organization from that perspective, if you're looking at it from a neutral, is not really selective of choice. So I think it's the founders and the actions that then determine how they go about addressing that cause. When we come down to the different functions within a business, We talked about marketing, we talked about the front office people, we talked about the advertising people. It's an interesting perspective that you bring up, simply because I think it boils down to the same thinking that I've been having, where these functions, even from the word go, are disintegrated. Part of it, I'd say, is a quote-unquote shortcoming on how organizations build their work functions, because how we sit around the table as leaders setting out the agenda for the organization, it should be more of like a channel of sorts, that you flawlessly pass the ball from one player to the next. When I talk about communications, I'm talking about a more of a bird's view approach, where communications, especially given the channels that you operate in and how we connect with our audiences, is continually becoming integrated. So sometimes when to separate these functions is quite difficult. Whilst, say, 15 years ago, the advertising people, what they did was quite different from what probably the PR person, the public relations person did, stroke comms, versus what the marketing person did, was quite different, because also of the channels and where you're meeting the consumer, it was quite different. But if you look at our world today, what you're doing in terms of your quote-unquote product activations is quite closely related to also how you're doing your billboards, also how you're advertising on digital platforms, also how you're engaging the customer at the front desk. And this cannot be seen as independent functions, because again, if we step out of the organization and look at it from the customer's perspective, we have said it, the customer does not see these different functions. So for us as business units internally to see it as totally different functions, I think is where the quote-unquote breakdown happens. And part of that is what then makes it quite hard to report, and to be quite frank, honest, sometimes make it quite a difficult conversation to have a discussion on what then is the return on investment on all these activities. And the danger in that is ultimately when it comes down to it and organizations are under duress, then all these functions are considered as cost centers. Whilst in its entirety, if they were looked at something that's more integrated, then we'd have a well-oiled machine that's delivering not even the sales or, the customer awareness. It's like you're delivering an experience to the customer regardless of at which point they're intersecting with you based on your job function. And that's, for me, that's where we really need to really think clearly of how can we do this better. In the integrated world that we are living in, how then do we bring these functions internally in a way that, one, ensures that there's that consistency of message and approach, and secondly, we have a unified way of reporting, and it all boils down to how then does this affect if we're talking about a profit company, bottom line, and how does this affect the theory of change if it's a non-profit organization?
Many a times we get this very question, what do you guys do? Which speaks to the so what.
Yes.
Okay, so you say, I have done A, I have done B, I have done C. At the end of the day, the question is, you have done it, thank you, So then, this is what I've been trying to make as a thesis, that at the end of the day, there are three things involved. There is profit, there is people, if you like, stakeholders, and there is planet. We could even forget about the planet for now. Now, we are coming to the communication person who says, I am here for reputation. I am here for relationships. Help me answer that question. If you are not here as a communication person for those reputations and for those relationships, what happens?
That's where now, back to what we've discussed, communications in itself cannot be an independent function. It needs to be linked to other things. Case in point, perhaps you have a very skilled communications person and they have the best ways of engaging your audiences or your customers if you're doing a for-profit organization. And they're able to wow them and draw them in, and you're getting massive levels of engagement. But your supply chain is broken. Your activations are broken. The billboards are not really resonating. So regardless of what the communications person does, if these other functions are not already well built in a way that then allows the communication person to deliver well, then all that effort is in vain. The same case applies for when the communication person does not exist. How I perceive communications in this way, I kind of see communications as a listening ear, like a pipeline, where you're able to synthesize a scenario or create an environment where you're really listening to what the market is saying. So you put out some communications and you're keen to know, will this drive the decisions or actions that I was hoping for? So it's not just about putting it out there and disappearing and waiting for the next time that you have something that you're putting out there and disappearing. But the communications function then becomes kind of a pipeline where you put out things from within the organization, have a way of bringing back that feedback that you're getting from the people that you're serving or the people that you're targeting with your communications. And from that, feed that back into your teams, be it product development, be it the supply chain people, be it the activation people. So if communications was not there, basically you're missing that pipeline, because all these functions have some limitations in how they do their things that doesn't really provide that continuous mining of information and using that information to basically improve how you do your things internally before you go out to the next batch of communications. So that's what I'd say the biggest function of a communications person is: create that interface between the organization and their audiences, collect that feedback stroke analysis from those interactions, and enable the organization to fine-tune their approach to how they're meeting, quote unquote, again, the needs. So I'd say we need, when the CEOs are sitting in board meetings and making those big promises of this year we'll elevate our sales by 35%, to have the communications people sitting in the room. Because unfortunately what happens is those decisions are made in isolation of the functions that can help deliver that. Then you're brought in when the paper has already been signed and you're being told, okay, we have already committed to this, regardless of what insights you have from the market. This is the target against which we need to meet. And of course, that's kind of like a broken system. If you are having those conversations where all these people are seated in the room, then you'd have a bit more quote unquote realistic picture. You could find that even perhaps based on the insights that you have from your teams, your marketing teams, your communication teams, your other teams, advertising and all that, that maybe you're even underquoting because maybe they've seen a need that could be met in a different way, diversifying, simplifying. We remember when the Kadogo economy became a big phenomenon in Kenya. Maybe there's untapped markets that these people have insights from their interactions with the final end user of whatever it is that the organization is producing or servicing that allows them to have better insights and allows then the CEO to make more realistic, quote unquote, targets and promises in terms of the organization's capacity to deliver against a specific context.
If we had one bullet and you're told just pick one department between marketing, communication, and customer experience, which one would you pick?
Well, I don't believe in silver bullets, so I wouldn't. I wouldn't pick either because, again, as I said, the world we're living in, these are not independent functions, and strategic communications basically is integrated communications and marketing and advertising and public relations, and these things by themselves are not independent. So it's like starting a journey to Nairobi CBD and getting halfway and saying, you know what, because mine was getting the product to market, then this is where I stop. Then the advertising people are like, oh, mine was just a billboard and we've put it up on Wayaki Way and that's where we are tasked with, and that's our budget is finished. So you really can't desegregate without encountering some loss in the best way of how to reach your audience. Because again, remember, we said the whole goal is to ensure that the customer experience and the customer delivery is in a way that was envisioned by the organization in meeting the need. And observing what is happening when the customer is experiencing your product, service, or delivery of whatever theory of change you're implementing, and using that feedback to basically look back into how you're delivering your approach. So I wouldn't really say I'd pick one. I'd find a way to make it work, even if it's on quote unquote a smaller scale, then probably use that as a case for maybe campaigning for better budgets or a better understanding of how the organization then would deliver all these functions.
And you put it already very nicely. This is IMC. It is no longer marketing and it is no longer communication. And I don't know whether people should be studying these things in isolation, because where I sit, I struggle to hear somebody say they are not able to explain how they contribute to profitability. Every communication person has had the experience of somebody being asked, so what do you say you do? Why? So why do people come and ask, what did you say you do? What do you do? That is a disturbing question. To me, that is the greatest feedback that communication people have ever received. So how do we deal with that? Do we keep explaining this is what we do? Or do we now look back at it and say, okay, do you realize that that product was a result of our feedback? Because somebody said, this product is lame. And because of that, we interrogated this feedback in terms of what does it mean when somebody says it is lame? What does it mean when somebody says, whatever it is product, it is behavior, it is the attitudes, the perceptions that exist, and this is what we brought. But at the end of the day, we brought it and somebody took over. We didn't get to the bottom, to the end of it. I don't know, help me. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yes. Let me try and think about how we can best then justify, quote unquote, our value as communications people. And I think it boils back to, as you've said, people asking you, what exactly then do you do? Mm-hmm. And I think for us to answer that question, we have to look at the context in which you're operating in. Because fine, the business is there to serve a goal, but you're not existing in a vacuum. You're existing in a world, and this world has, of course, your target audiences, your target markets, but at the same time, it also has competitors and other dynamics that affect the effectiveness of your business in achieving its goal. So I recently had a very interesting term that I'll share with you. We're living in a VUCA world, VUCA. Mm-hmm. So the world is volatile, the world is very uncertain, the world is very complex, and the world is ambiguous. And these are not static states. The world that we knew towards the end of last year is not the world that we've woken up to in January, is not the same world we're living in February. And that context applies for both for-profit and non-profit. All these other functions do not have, quote unquote, the privilege that communications might have to influence the perceptions and the decisions of your end user, target audiences, stakeholders, like communication does. I think the power of communication is the ability to influence attitudes and perceptions and make you almost like loyal to a cause or an issue or a product. I'm sure you've seen some things that from the outside looking in, you might look at someone and say, why would they do that at such a time? But because of the communications aspect and the relationship that they have to a certain organization or a product or a service, for them it makes sense. Case in point, you'll find some people struggling to make ends meet if we are talking about a small household. But there are things that they'll never sacrifice in that house. You find that they're still probably paying like a TV subscription. Mm-hmm. And you're like, if you're really struggling to, but then it also shows the value that they have put in that product or service, that regardless of what is happening, for them, this is the one thing that I'll never let go of. So we can never really underestimate the continuous need for engaging our end users, stakeholders, customers, and building a belief system around why you need to continually believe. I'd actually call communications people chief evangelists. Think about the missionaries back in the day when they were bringing the gospel. They must have had an incredible belief in whatever it is that they were bringing, to cross oceans and frontiers, come to these people, sell your message with conviction, continually monitor the reception, and continually see how you tweak that approach to make sure that by the time you're leaving, you're basically creating another set of believers who will champion the same cause. So I think for me, communication is that continuous effort of what is it that our people are saying? How do we influence our perceptions and attitudes? And I think that's why, especially in authoritarian states, communication is then a big leverage, because whoever controls the message controls the masses. Mm-hmm. Maybe what we can say is like the way the communication is being crafted is not responsive to the markets or the audiences. But then again, I'd argue to say maybe the way it's being done is in a way that doesn't look as at the quote-unquote wholesome person. So maybe the marketing people are marketing, that we think this product would be ideal for women. But then you're not dealing with a woman in isolation. What other facets does this woman represent? Mm-hmm. What are her belief systems? And what are the things that would make her believe, regardless of anything, I'd still continue to put my money here, or spend my revenue here, or continue to visit this place or do this activity? Mm-hmm. Communication is what gives you that kind of influence to consistently influence the end user or the stakeholder or the decision maker. So a lack of that is basically creating a vacuum where all these uncertainties in the fora that you're operating in could easily even topple over your business model without you having ample time to then react in a way that allows you to stay afloat and still be able to achieve the business goal. So what we have discussed, for you to be able to achieve that lasting change, for you to be able to create those quote-unquote believers that we've spoken about, it's not a one-time interaction. It's a continued journey of continuously testing and seeing where is my audience at, where are my stakeholders at, and how do we continue to move them up the ladder of the belief system or whatever it is that you're trying to influence them to do. For you to be successful in doing that, of course, it needs time. The unfortunate thing is, in an organization that's seeking to achieve a certain outcome, we don't have indefinite amount of times. We don't have indefinite amount of resources for you to just continuously for the next 2 years be doing this progressive approach towards that ultimate goal. You have to have quick wins or low-hanging fruits that justify why you're putting an investment in whatever it is that you're doing. And I think that's where now you'll find for many organizations, especially if you're looking at it from a consulting perspective, when you're contracted as an agency and you're told, hey, we are giving you this account, one of the things that you'll find that the organization itself has done is that they have kind of key performance indicators, and they're like, hey, we think we need 4 op-eds, we think we need 3 newspaper articles or interviews for our senior staff, think we need X, Y, and Z, depending on whatever measures they will use for them to feel like there's traction being made. So the quick wins basically prove the approach that you're taking is effective. Think of it like a weight loss program. If 8 months down the line there's zero change, then it's very hard to get people to still stay committed to the course.
Yeah.
So the quick wins in comms is similar. Like, what are the quick things we can do to basically show that the trajectory we have set allows us to be able to achieve that longer term lasting change and create those quote unquote believers that over time will walk with us the journey of this organization and eventually help us achieve that impact that we are aiming for. So I think that's where the balance comes in. As a comms person, you always have to look at what are the things that we can do short term, but then, as we said, what structures then can you put in place to enable you to then have a bigger return in the long term. So part of it is kind of those gaps that you're saying, sorting out the gaps internally to ensure that marketing, advertising, and comms, those things are not overnight fixes, because even of just how organizations are structured, how teams are structured, how supply chains are structured. But then in the interim, as we're trying to resolve our own internal issues and think of the longer term, what else can we be doing in the interim that shows we are making progress towards our desired goals? So I think that's the approach that we always have to have, a short-term one for quick wins and a long-term one for those fundamental changes that will eventually help deliver bigger outcomes.
How many CEOs can you name that have a communication background?
Interesting.
And so the question, why?
I don't know if I know any top of mind that actually have that communication background, but what I do know for most CEOs, once they rise to that level of leadership and prominence, then communications becomes one of the skill sets that they're required to do. So you'll find a lot of them going through formal training or informal training within the organization where they're now equipped with communication skills, because I think it's important for an organization's leader to be able to articulate very well and in a compelling way and in a way that's, short, nice and sweet.
All right, think about that question again. Why communication people somehow are not the CEOs? Why? Thank you very much, Saburi Chirimi, for your time. It was a very, very deep conversation.
And thank you for having me.